Hello. So this is going to be the first chapter of our book, The Personality Puzzle by David C. Funder. This chapter is the study of the person, and it's just kind of an introduction to what exactly psychologists that study personality are considering and think about. So, some of the objectives that we'll go over, we're going to discuss some things that personality psychologists study. We're going to define what personality actually is. We're going to discuss the goal of personality psychology and how this leads to the basic approaches and the different approaches, and kind of touch on what those different approaches are. And then just kind of discuss some of the advantages and the disadvantages of personality psychology and the study of it. So, one thing that you might have seen in like an intro class, or if you've ever done some sort of like clinical class, you might have heard of the psychological triad. And the psychological triad basically is combining how people think, so our cognitions, what we feel, so our emotions and our physiological responses, and how we behave, so our actions. And really, what we do with this is see how those three things, so how we think, we feel, and we behave, how they interact with each other. Now, when it comes to clinical psychology, um, just clinical psychologists, when they look at this, they're going to be asking what is abnormal or what is kind of the extremes of these. Whereas personality psychologists are going to be asking more of what is normal. And so while there's a lot of overlap between clinical psychologists and personality psychologists, the main difference to note is that clinical psychologists are going to be, again, looking for these either disordered patterns within that psychological triad, or the distressful kind of out of the ones that pull it out from that normal um, traits that we're looking at. So personality psychologists are going to study those normal patterns, and clinical psychologists are going to look at the unusual patterns. So um, an example, I guess, would be to think of like conscientiousness. If you've ever heard of conscientiousness, it means kind of how organized a person is. So if you're high in conscientiousness, you're probably this very organized type of personality. So you've got a binder that maybe has different, tabs, or maybe you've labeled everything. Your closet is organized between colors, or I don't know, whatever it is, right? So that's somebody who's high in conscientiousness might be more of that type of personality. So a personality psychologist is just going to note that that's what that is, whereas somebody who's a clinical psychologist might be looking for the extremes of conscientiousness. So that would be somebody who would be like suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder, where everything has to be a certain way, or where you have this compulsion to make sure that things are in a particular way. Otherwise, it causes distress for that person, and that's the main difference. Where one's looking at, okay, what is a pattern of the in within this normal range, and then clinical psychologists are asking what's not normal, and what is unusual behaviors. So that I hope that kind of makes sense. But either way, on both of them, we're trying to ask like about the whole person. So what is the person um, in context of all of these things? So in context of how they feel, how they think, how they behave, and also in the context of what they're actually in right together. So maybe their social elements, or their developmental elements, or even their biological elements. So but just to like give an actual definition of personality, the definition given by the book is an individual's characteristic patterns of thought, emotions, and behavior. Again, that's that psychological triad that I just talked about. So those characteristic patterns of the triad, together with the psychological mechanisms hidden or not behind those patterns. And so, characteristic though does not necessarily mean the same thing in all situations with all people. So, for example, if you are the type of person that is naturally more introverted, so, that doesn't mean that you're naturally introverted in every single situation. So, if you're an introvert, you can potentially also show extroversions at times. But we're looking at, well, what is the most characteristic pattern? What happens most often? What is your kind of, which one would you prefer to lean towards most of the time? But so that's what we're looking for. Um, Alternatively, another definition is an individual's unique and relatively consistent patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And so this is like an emphasis of what makes people unique, and that personality is only relatively consistent. So, one of the problems with studying personality is that it's kind of an impossible mission. So it's mission impossible, right? In that, um, while we try to look at the whole person, realistically, it's impossible to account for everything at the same time. And so, for example, think of an important behavior that you've performed recently, and all the reasons that you acted or behaved the way that you did. You might realize, I acted this way because I was tired or hungry, or like I just got into a fight, or, you know, last time that I did something like this, it worked out for me, or it didn't work out for me, right? And so you're trying to account for all of these variables, and realistically, it's almost impossible to do that. But it is more, mm, what's the word I'm looking for? Like palatable, maybe, but more reasonable. Let's go with reasonable. It's more reasonable to look at a person in their daily environment, and just kind of look at as much as you can in that situation. And so that's really what we're trying to do. And so we can't account for everything, but we can kind of get close to it if we look at, well, maybe their daily environments and how they act in that environment regularly. So, if you see on the right, there's this little nifty uh, table, and lists some of the basic approaches, and you can kind of think of them as different personality theories. If you want paradigms, probably a more accurate term. So, different paradigms of viewpoints of personality. And of these, you see kind of right here this trait approach. I'd say trait approach and learning and cognitive approaches are probably the most popular of these theoretical nowadays. But we also look into this one's pretty popular too, which is biological approach. And this is a biological approach would be looking at the anatomy, the physiology, the genetics, whereas trait approach is going to be focusing on how differences might be conceptualized or measured and followed over time. And this one's probably the largest and most dominant approach. Uh, Alternatively, a psychoanalytic approach is more based off of Freudian theory, and thus kind of focus more on this unconscious mind, and a lot of mental conflicts, as maybe Freud would call it, right? Where it's asking, maybe there's things that you're not even aware of that are causing you to act and behave certain ways. And so it focuses in on more of that type of approach. The phenomenological approach is more focused on the conscious experience. So whereas psychoanalytic is more of the unconscious, what you're not aware of. The phenomenological one is what you actively are consciously aware of and how you're interpreting it, being in that environment. So there's some offshoots of this. So one is more of this Rogerian, so based off of Carl Rogers' humanistic approach, and this is kind of how your unique human attributes produce meaning in your life and how you perceive that meaning and how you gain happiness from it. And so, it's basically how you are have these human qualities to you, right? It's like it focuses more on this creative element of somebody because they're interpreting things, and it's about this free will of a person. So that's the humanistic kind of portion. And there's also this cross cultural one. So maybe how the experience of your reality is dictated by your cultural experience. How you interpret the world is through this cultural lenses that you're a part of. And you're a part of many different cultural things. So, for example, obviously, there's this Hawaiian perspective, and there's a U.S. perspective, and there's a gendered perspective, and there's a ethnic perspective, and there's age perspectives, and how each of these might intermingle with each other and produce kind of the outcome of personality through those lenses. Um, Also, like I said, learning and cognitive process is also pretty common. Um, this type of approach is going to be more about like that classic behavioralism and how it basically our personality is affected by either rewards or punishments. So think like B.F. Skinner if you think back to your intro to psych days, right, where you have things that are going to reward certain behaviors or punish certain behaviors. So, meaning we're going to either increase a behavior or decrease a behavior based on the outcomes of the the trial, right? It can also be about life experiences. So, what have you witnessed in your life, or what have you seen other people do that led them to be successful? Right? So, again, it's more of this B.F. Skinner or even Albert Bandura, if you remember his kind of modeling behaviors, right? Where you watch somebody do something and then you emulate that. And so it focuses more on, what have you learned through these reinforcers or punishers or just watching, and how do you process it and, makes it so that you do certain behaviors because of it. Now, each of these address different questions, really. So, while some people will really kind of put into one of these over others, and that definitely does happen, I will say that they um, they can't explain everything by themselves as much as we wish they could. They really don't. And so each of them are kind of explaining different questions, right? And so, for example, um, you know, let's say that somebody gets into an accident, like a car accident or something, and they have a head injury, right? A biological approach would probably be the best approach in explaining how that trauma, the brain trauma, has impacted their personality, right? So that's going to be more appropriate in that situation, but that's not always, that biological approach may not be applicable in every single question we ask. So, for example, if we ask, what made a, um, you know, what made a person, or I guess another, uh, what makes a person more or less um, neurotic. So basically, um, having an ability to control their emotions, right? Um, Maybe there's a biological component to that, but it's possible that they are emulating their parents' when they were younger, and so they saw their parents, and that would be more of that learning approach. So they're asking different questions, and so they're not really mutually exclusive from one another, and you can't really ignore uh, any of them because of that. So the one big theory, we kind of want a one big theory, and I understand that, like, one theory, instead of looking at all these approaches, we want like one theory to explain everything. But really, we can't do that. Personality psychologists have not figured out how to solve this dilemma of putting them all together. Some would like to think that their approach is the one big theory, um, and some believe that their approach is the one big theory. Um, I venture to say, though, um, that some believe that different approaches address different questions, and therefore, um, we should just look at all of them as we see fit. And so, it's probably more that all of them kind of, you can pick from all of them to explain certain questions. So, what are some advantages and disadvantages of looking um, at personality? First of all, I guess we should talk about Funder's first law, and he says that great strengths are usually great weaknesses, and surprisingly, when the opposite is true as well. So, for example, um, um, my sister is extremely extroverted. She is very social, and whenever you put her in a room, even if it's complete stranger, she's trying to talk to them, get to know them, bouncing around, making sure everybody's having a good time. She's that type of personality, and that's a great strength of hers, because you know that she's great at networking, and she's great at connecting with people, and she gets energized, and that makes other people energized around her in social environments. But the opposite can be that one of her weaknesses is that sometimes that can be off-putting to people. I'm sure that you've possibly been in a situation before where somebody who's super outgoing comes up to you, and you're like, oh man, this is a lot of energy coming at me at once. I like, and you're kind of taken aback by that, and it might be a little bit off-putting to some people. And so in this case, for her, you know that's a weakness. She's reading people, and recognizing that maybe they're not on her level there, right? And so, just, it's a strength of hers, but it's also a weakness in some ways. And so we can also say the opposite's true, right? Um, there's strengths in our weaknesses, and there's weaknesses in our strengths, right? So, yeah, it's just something to keep in mind, is that when we talk about these different elements, you know, there's good things and there's going to be bad things to everything that we talk about. Also, when we want to account for the whole person, um, but there's also some advantages to looking at the whole person, which is that we're being very inclusive. We're trying to look at every aspect of a person's life, everything that's interesting, everything that might be important. But because we are so over inclusive, it can really be disjointed or unfocused at times, where you get so confused because there's so many things going on that you're like, I really don't know which one is, impacting this person the most. And that can be a hindrance when we're trying to study this type of things. Um, Also, when it comes to like basic approaches, it's good at addressing certain problems, but it's really poor at addressing other problems. I think we just kind of I explained that in a few slides ago. But basically, you can't explain everything with just one approach, and therefore it's kind of good at answering certain questions, but not so good at answering all the questions. Another problem with studying personality is that it can be pigeonholing. And so, pigeonholing is putting people into specific categories. Um, you know, Other areas of psychology treat all people as if they were the same, right? So, um, when we think of individual differences, it's seen as like an error to some level. Personality psychologists are all about the individual differences. We like them. The problem is that when we are figuring out the individual differences on how, this person is different from this person, sometimes we accidentally put them into those categories that we don't necessarily want. And so if I tell somebody, hey, you tend to be, um, I don't know, very open, right? You're very open to new experiences, and you like trying new things, right? Sometimes we put them in that category that they feel like I always have to try new things because that's who I am. And it's like, well, if you like it, if you want to do new things, great. But sometimes even the most open people don't want to do new things, um, or at least new particular things. But because we've labeled them, they might get the feeling that they have to do that now. And so that's kind of a negative. Positive, though, is because we're all about those individual differences, it leads to this sensitivity and this respect for those individual differences. We're not just trying to discount them, we're trying to almost celebrate them in some ways and say, you are different than the other person, right? And so, why are you different than the other person? And looking for those little tiny differences between us. And so that's kind of, you know, one thing to consider as well. I'm going to go ahead and stop this here. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully it's giving you a little bit of dipping over the toe into the science behind personality. And good luck on the first week of the semester. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I will try to get back to you as quickly as I can. But with that, I hope you're having a good day, and